My name is Heather Clayton, and I'm the new Director of Learning here at St. Michael's University School, and I could spend probably an hour telling you all the great things about that role, what it is, and what it could become. But suffice to say, I think I have one of the best jobs on the planet, and I'm just sort of finding my way in that. I want to thank you all for coming out this evening and taking time to consider and think about the developing brain. We live with them, we deal with them, both as teachers and as parents, and so it's a great opportunity for us to dialogue a little bit and learn some things, I hope. Okay, I just want to take a very quick minute and introduce myself a little bit. I'm a recent grad of the Masters of Arts in Leadership program at Royal Roads University, an awesome learning experience. And while I came from Ontario, for the last 2 years I've been coming from Ontario for that program. And so it was a great way to learn a lot about leadership. I also have spent about 22 years of my life as a teacher, working in both middle and secondary school classrooms, and really enjoying a variety of students. We also had the opportunity in 2000 to do an exchange to Australia as a teacher, so I had a bit of experience there in the outback of Australia. More recently, my work has been with teachers, and that's what this position really is all about, is working with teachers in their growth and development as great practitioners, and doing some collaborative work around good teaching practices, which of course links to brain research as well as some other great pedagogical learning that's going on. And the final piece, and I think the piece that probably qualifies me here tonight, is that I'm a parent of 3 kids. I have 3 adolescent brains that I'm currently responsible for in my home. And 2 of them live in Ontario still, they're going to university, and my almost 15-year-old came with us to St. Michael's. In terms of our goals for tonight, a couple of things that I would really like to do. I want to help us better understand how brains develop. This is such a growing field, and so even what we talk about tonight, in 3 to 5 years' time, we may need to revisit. It's a really growing field. And I also want to look at the ways that brain research links to our children, to their learning, and to their, and therefore our, lives. And so those are the pieces that I think we're going to kind of focus on tonight as we do that. I want to say, too, that it's evening and we're pretty tired, so kudos to you for being here. And know that as questions come up and there are things you want to address, please feel free to ask me that. Any questions? I had come at this as an educator primarily. About 6 or 7 years ago, I got interested in brain research. And so I was really interested as a teacher, and then I started to see overlap into parenting. But I'm not a brain researcher per se, right? I'm pulling from the materials and the resources. So there may be questions that you ask and I say, that's a great question. I'll look that up and get back to you. And hopefully you're okay with that. I'll try to do what I can. Okay. One of the things that I like to start with, and the teachers here are getting used to this, is that this series of faces. And I want you to think for a minute, you all did a variety of things to get here tonight. Which face best represents how you feel right now in this moment and why? And you have about 30 seconds or so to talk to someone around you about which face and why. And then I'll bring you back together and explain why we did this, okay? Okay, so if I were to ask you to kind of self-identify, how many of you said tonight I am an E as I come in here at 7 o'clock on a Thursday night? All right, welcome. Thanks for coming out. How many of you said I'm a D? Awesome. How many of you said C? I made it. I'm here. Awesome. How about B? It's been a long week. And when I do this with students or with teachers, I don't ask the A people to self-disclose. I think that's a very private place to be. But I will say that I do hope that tonight you don't move any further to the right than you already are. My goal would be that you're moving to the right. That's it. We don't want you to go that way. Whichever way that is. Interesting that we do this, and you can think, well, that's kind of fun. When we're talking about brain research, affect, how we feel, what's going on for us in the moment, is really important. It's really important in the classroom, but it's also important in our home. And getting kids to engage and living with kids, as you know, emotion can come into that periodically. And so we need to, I think, name it and be clear about it and recognize that that is truly a part of how we relate, and it does impact the development of our brain. And we'll talk a little more about that later. In your package you have this, it's a bit of a roadmap really, And we're not going to go through it detail by detail tonight. I'm doing another session in about a month on the adolescent brain, more specifically, and I think we'll be digging a little more deeply at that point. But I included it in your package because I think it's a valuable thing to have really as a roadmap, and it will help as we go through to think about what parts of the brain do certain things happen. So I've given that to you tonight as just a reference. What I would like to do now is I have some brain facts on label. I'm going to ask you just to take one and pass it along. And we'll start up here as well. And I may need to get a few more. So on each of these slips of paper, there is a fact about the brain. And another thing that's interesting about brain research is we need to prime our brains to get ready to learn about something. Just take one complete sheet and then pass them on. Perfect. In classrooms, we call it activating prior knowledge. At home, we might call it something like, getting ready to have the conversation or preparing ourselves. What do we need to think about before we talk about what time we need to come in on Friday night or that kind of thing. So each of the slips of paper has a brain fact on it. And we're going to do it again. This is a tricky room to move about in, I get that. But we're going to do an activity where, did anybody not get one? Up at the back there, okay. I'm going to ask you in a minute to get up and move around, and the goal would be that you're going to try to collect 10 different brain facts. You have about 4 minutes to do that in. But the way that you collect them, lest you've already started swapping with your neighbor, is that you're going to read your fact each time you exchange it. Okay, so if I had stress releases a hormone cortisol, which makes it hard to remember things, I need to say that before I give it to somebody. And they're going to tell me their brain fact, and then they're going to swap, and I'm going to put it on here. So by the end, I'm going to have 10. Okay, does that make sense? So you're going to go home tonight with this sheet with 10 different brain facts on it. I think there's 10. So I hope that by repeating, I hope you repeated your fact as you exchanged it. And by repeating it, you're able to internalize it. And what we've done from a brain research perspective is that we've activated your prior knowledge. Now you've got this file drawer labeled brain research that's got some stuff in it, and it's just open and primed, ready for the rest of the stuff that we'll put in this evening, the rest of the learning that we'll put in this evening. So that's sort of the purpose behind that activity. When I did that activity with students that were struggling, some who couldn't read very well and so on, it was interesting to me that I did that activity, spent an hour going over brain research, and at the end we had to share something we remembered. And it was that fact, because they had to repeat it over and over and over again. So it's just interesting when you think about the multiple ways that our brain works. Something that's a theme that we'll run through tonight, and really any of the work that we do together, is that the goal of the brain is to survive. And that plays out in lots of ways. We see sort of the fight or flight idea occurring, and again we'll talk a little more about that perhaps the next time. But you'll see it as we talk about the developing brain as well. Our brain is programmed to survive and to be the best, strongest brain that it can be. And so some things happen, and we'll explore those. I'm going to talk with 3 different kinds of learning keys tonight, and then I'm going to spend about the last 10 or 15 minutes, 10 minutes or so on the growth versus fixed mindsets. So the first piece that I want to talk about is how do those pathways in our brain grow? What's that all about? And there's lots that's been written about that in terms of the growth and development of the brain. What it's talking about is that we're born with about 200 billion neurons, and after about 10 to 12 years, we have 100 billion. The neurons are the cells, one of the 2 types of cells that are in our brain. And, if I do the math or I try to graph that and plug my age into that, it looks like a pretty depressing statistic, right? We start here and we just keep going downhill. But the good news is that it's not necessarily about those brain cells, it's about the pathways that grow out of those cells called dendrites. And so we grow dendrites from the moment we're conceived, from the moment we arrive in the world, and we learn and we grow. But there are primary times when that happens. And so the best time of growth is sort of 0 to 5, and you can imagine all the learning that goes on then. But 0 to 19 is kind of the next window. The good news for us as adults is we can also continue to grow and develop these pathways. But what we tend to do more as adults is make connections between existing pathways. And so that's just an interesting kind of shift in terms of what happens. So we want, this picture comes out of a book by a woman named Kathy Nunley, and she says you would much prefer to have a mighty oak neuron than a Charlie Brown Christmas tree neuron. The goal here is that we want to grow sort of the richest pathways that we can in our brain, particularly in that developmental time, which incidentally or interestingly coincides with school, right? The years of school, or most of the years of school. And so we want to be conscious of how those pathways grow. So what does that look like? If you can imagine that this is a brain, and I know it's a really kind of a sad picture of a brain, and then within the brain are all these different neurons, tons and tons and tons, which we can, can't even see. If we were going to go from, let's look at the visual stimuli when you're born and when you come into this earth, when you arrive on the earth and you're born. When you're born, I don't know how to describe that. When you're born, the first face that you might see when you're born would be, who would you see first? The doctor? And so visually, because your eyes are connected to these neurons, that's one way that you grow pathways, you would create a pathway of connections representing seeing the doctor. But I don't know how about you, but I haven't really seen the doctor that I saw when I was born much at all, right, over time. And so over time, you wouldn't necessarily build or develop those connections. On the other hand, another face you'll see very soon after you're born is your mom. And so what happens is, again, your eyes pick up and your brain starts to make connections to seeing your mom. But the great thing is that you see her again and again and again, and that same pathway gets really strongly and firmly embedded, so that there's no issue with recognition or who that is, and it becomes very natural and very easy. This other pathway of the original doctor, if you're not seeing that doctor on a regular basis, gradually that pathway will just basically dry up and not be there anymore. And so our brain continues to develop pathways and build strong ones and get rid of other pathways that aren't necessarily being used. So interesting to sort of think about that in terms of parenting and growth. How would this idea apply to our kids? Well, when I think about this, I think about what are the opportunities? Because we grow these pathways when we're exposed to new things, but we grow these deeper pathways when we work away at things, right? And so I would want to be exposing my kids to a lot of different things so that they're having those experiences. If we have students, and I'm sure there are no St. Michael students that do this, but if you have a student that goes home and does video games for 4 hours every night, they're going to have very strong pathways, right, that are connected with the visual stimuli and all the different bits that go into that video game. But there'll be other parts of their brain that are not being as utilized, that gradually, again, because of survival, they'll say, wow, there hasn't been much action up here, and those bits get weeded out. So the message here is not that we need to go crazy and expose our kids to things all the time, but it is good to know what are they seeing, what are they learning, and how's that happening. We're going to talk a little more about that in terms of stress, because I think that's the next kind of logical thing that we can look at.